Welcome to the Life in Norway Show. Today I'm joined by Eldbjørg Hemsing, a Norwegian violinist who has lived in Austria and Germany and played all over the world. We talk about the fascinating world of music in Norway, specifically traditional folk music, and the role Norway's nature, mythology and languages play in it. You can find out more information on today's show, including links to everything we talk about, on the show notes page at lifeinnorway.net/podcast. And what better way to introduce the interview today than with some of Eldbjørg's music. Happy listening. I'd like to welcome Eldbjørg Hemsing to the latest episode of the Life in Norway show. Eldbjørg is a violinist and host of the Nordics Unveiled podcast and is from the traditional area of Valdres in Norway. Eldbjørg, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Now, let's find out a bit about you and your work. Tell us a little bit about your career.
So I'm a classically trained violinist. I started playing when I was 5 years old. I come from a really teeny tiny little village in Valdres, in Norway called Valdres. And this village in Valdres has around 600 inhabitants. So it's fairly small, but I grew up with a lot of music around me. My mom is also a violinist and I have an older sister who's also playing violin. So music was somehow a very natural way of expressing everything basically. And I started performing when I was fairly young. I can still remember my first concert. I was 6 years old and I played for the royal family of Norway for the Constitution Day, May 17th, at the National Theatre in Oslo. And I think that was just, the fire was ignited from that experience. And now I travel the world. Well, not this year, but normally I would travel the world and give concerts and just have a really, really cool life as a traveling musician.
So do you play solo concerts or are you part of a larger group?
So I'm a soloist, but I play with a lot of symphony orchestras. So that means it's me against up to 100 other players trying to play the solo part. But it's a really fun thing to do. So that is everywhere from the US to Asia to Europe, Scandinavia. It's a bit all over. I also, of course, play with smaller groups, such as chamber orchestras, or even with just a pianist, or just by myself. So it's quite a big variation.
Excellent. Now, I had a little time on your website earlier before we spoke, and I saw some information about the Grieg violin sonatas. Could you tell us a bit about that? What's that all about?
So being a Norwegian, it's very hard not to play Grieg, I think, because he is in many ways, I think so many people will recognize him as the sound of Norway. He really, in many ways, became the face and the sound of what we so much associate what Norway is, and huge part of the culture. Grieg for me is also a very personal connection through my family. It's a bit of a longer story, so I'll try and make it not too long, but Grieg, when he was young, he went to Leipzig to study, which was very much the fashion back in that time in the 1800s. When he came back, he was really well trained in the kind of German Lied tradition, very, very proper schooling, and that's what he was taught to do. He came back to Norway, and his godfather was actually the big superstar Ole Bull, which was probably the greatest artist and violinist we had also in the 1800s, and a huge influence in music life in Norway, even to this day. He was his godfather, and he told Edvard Grieg that this is really not what you are supposed to do. You're supposed to represent your country. You have to travel. You have to understand what the real identity is. And keep in mind, this was after a long union. I believe that must have been the Denmark, and then the Sweden one came afterwards. I mean, it was such a big search of finding out what was the identity of Norway, what was really the true sound of Norway. So Edvard Grieg, of course, he couldn't travel himself everywhere in the 1800s. As you know, even today, it's not always that easy to go get around in Norway with all the mountains and, snow and whatnot. So he trusted a lot of collectors who he sent out around in Norway. And one of those collectors, he came to Valdres, where I'm from, and he went south in Valdres, where he met one of my ancestors, my great and possibly another great grandfather, who was singing a few tunes to him. And this collector, he wrote them down and he brought them back to the National Library. And somehow Grieg saw this later on. And he actually decided to use that little melody of my ancestor as the theme and main inspiration for one of his biggest piano pieces, the greatest piece, which is the Ballad, Opus 24. So I felt really, it's a kind of such a random connection in a way, but I feel very close to Grieg's music also because so much of it is taken from the folk music. It's such a pure lyrical expression. And to me, it definitely sounds very Norwegian.
What a fascinating connection. Now, Eldbjørg, you mentioned you come from a village of a few hundred people. I come from a village in England of maybe 1,000 people, so fairly similar.
Nice. Yes.
The big difference, though, is I was not surrounded by music at all. Music wasn't really a part of my upbringing besides, pop music on the TV. So how did you get started? When you were a child, is it normal to be surrounded by this musical inspiration in the rural areas in Norway, or is it part of the education system, something to do with your family, or a mix of all these things?
I think mainly it was my family. My mom is really passionate about music, and my father used to work with environment and nature, and sometimes he had to leave in the evenings because there was some sort of emergency up in Jotunheimen somewhere. And my mom might, she would have a concert, and it's not always that easy to get babysitters in such a small village. So we would actually just go with her to the concerts, and we kind of just grew up thinking this is super normal. Of course, we should be doing this. No problem about it. But having said that, I think Valdres also is very rich in folk music. It's a very strong tradition for it. Actually so strong, in fact, that a lot of the tunes that come from Valdres have their own specific rhythm. So you could say that there's also a part of identity to be pronounced in also in the rhythm. And growing up with music, it's also very important to you have your peers, your friends, that you all gather and do something that's, bigger than yourself. So I was very fortunate to be able to go to a really great school, both in Valdres but also in Oslo, which was taking care of more the classical side when it comes to classical music. And then I had more of the folk music back home and that kind of environment. So it was a bit divided, but I think that Valdres today has a very, very big community of people who love music and who learn to play. And that's really great. I'm really happy about that.
It sounds as if music was always the course that you were on.
Oh, definitely. I don't think I ever thought about doing something else. And I actually have never done anything else either. So that's kind of how that panned out.
That's interesting because for me in England, and I think it's the same in many other countries as well, if you in your early teenage years express an interest in becoming a professional musician, a lot of parents are going to say, maybe you should think about law school or at least go to university first or whatever. But so in Norway, is that the case as well? Were you just lucky, or is being a professional musician a viable career option for Norwegians?
Well, in Norway, we are very lucky in that sense that a lot of the art organizations are state supported. So in many ways, it's also a sense of it is important for society that you have art institutions and that they give something back. So I think Norway is probably, particularly now in this pandemic, you can really see that Norway is one of the safest countries to be a musician in, because you really are well taken care of. Actually, not only as a musician, as a citizen in general, I would say. But when it comes to my specific case, it's a bit hard to say whether it would have changed if I didn't have really dedicated parents who really thought this was important and it gave something really great back. I think a lot of it also comes from that I started really early. I was already traveling by the time I was 9-10 years old and did tours and was fairly international. Even at that point, I did quite a few tours in Central Europe. We had spent the summers in the US. You really had it was such a natural thing to do, to use music. And one great thing about playing us is that it's such an international environment. So you meet friends and colleagues from all over the world, and it really it's a really wonderful thing to do. And I feel extremely lucky to be able to work and do something that I first of all love so much and gives me so much, but also that I can do that full time. I don't think that's necessarily given all the time.
This year, you've started a podcast, Nordics Unveiled. We'll come on to talk specifically about the show later. One of the things it seems you're trying to do on the show is to define what Nordic music is. Let's go a little bit more specific than that and talk about what Norwegian music is, because I think a lot of people will have different views on this. Some people will quickly think Grieg. Some people will think Aha. Other people might think black metal music. So is there something that connects all these things? What is it that defines Norwegian music for you?
Well, it's you really hit the point when you say try to define, because it is actually really hard, and that's part of why it is so much fun to do this, because I also learned so much that I didn't either know or think about from before. But I think so far I had mostly classical musicians on the podcast. I also had I had a fantastic art historian who was there, and we are also now moving more into some other genres to try to get a more full picture of the whole Nordic area. But I think the one word that keeps coming up is nature. I think everyone has been referring nature to some extent, either as an inspiration or as an expression or as a reason for why they do or make the sound that they do, or make the expression that they want to show. So I think nature has had such an enormous impact. For many, it's been a way of feeling rooted and grounded. Norway in general does not have the longest music history. So in certain ways that has also given a lot of freedom, that there hasn't been so many set boxes that you have to fit in, because that's how it's always been done, I say in quotes. But so that you can see that also particularly in jazz, that it was a certain freshness, a certain playfulness, and also of course also in classical music there's a lot of playfulness and not so much being concerned about, oh, I learned this from my teacher, it must be this way. I think people are very brave in many ways to explore more and test more the limits, and of course from that you get some very, very interesting results.
That's fascinating, because again, coming back to my knowledge of music in England, so much of the famous genres that have been exported from England are quite political in their origins. I'm thinking punk and the Sex Pistols and so on. And it comes from a place of anger or desire to change, but doesn't seem to be the case in Norway. I'm sure there are some artists that incorporate some political messages into their music, but you're saying it's very much about nature, and you have of course a unique connection with nature here in Norway, I think, and you have some really interesting seasons. You have the northern lights, the freezing cold weather, the snow landscapes in the winter, and then the midnight sun and everything in the summer. So I can understand where that comes from. Has this been the same? So if you go back a few hundred years, you can still identify those nature themes in the music just like you can today?
Oh, absolutely. And probably even more before, because you had less opportunities to get around. I mean, for instance, today, if you want to go to the north, the very north of Norway, you have to fly everywhere between 3 to 4 hours. And that's just to get up to the very north. Imagine that in 200 years ago. I mean, how long it would take just to get to the very top of the country. It was such an undiscovered territory, quite simply because it was not easy to get there. And it was really tough. It was not easy. I mean, like you mentioned yourself, I mean, during the whole coastline of Norway, you really need to know what you're doing, and you have to be fine with some rough weather because it can get quite wild up there. But in many ways, what I think also defines, to a certain part, a lot of the Norwegianness is that you are, I think in most people's mind, maybe even if you're living in the bigger cities, but in most people's minds, you are, as we say, in one with nature. You are accepting that the nature and the forces of nature are stronger than you are, and you have to live with that. That's just how it is. As opposed to, I think, many, many other cities or countries around the world where you as human beings, you're just saying, well, I am the first in line and I decide. And that doesn't really work in Norway. for instance, I've traveled a lot in the north, and it's not uncommon if you fly somewhere and the weather is too bad, you have to just say, well, today I'm not flying. That's just, you wait a few days and try again. There's no one who would say, well, my meeting, I was supposed to be there 2 minutes ago. Like, it just doesn't, that kind of mentality just doesn't apply, because you just cannot. You are not stronger than the forces of nature. And I think that also impacted a lot of the mentality.
Staying with the topic of defining Norwegian music as far as we can, what sort of instruments are commonly seen in Norwegian folk music? Obviously, you're a violinist. What are the other common instruments?
So the two most common ones would be the Hardangerfiddle, which in Norwegian we say harigfele. But Hardangerfiddle was found in Hardanger in the 1600s. That's why it got the name Hardangerfiddle. And it's like a small violin, in that sense that it's not as wide as a normal violin would be. But what makes it really special is that it has 8 or 9 strings. So on top there's 4, like on a normal violin, but then you have 4 or 5 underlying under the bridge, just to resonate when you play. Which means that the Hardangerfiddle you can tune, I think, up to probably 28 or 29 different ways, depending on time of day, what you want to play, and what the mood is. So there's a lot of tuning to be done with Hardangerfiddle. And then the second instrument would be the Langeleik, which is it's around like a meter long, and it also has 7 or 8 strings. And you play with it with the plekter, and you also can play a lot of different tunes, but it's a very, very beautiful sound that it comes from it. It's not very loud, but it's also very much a listening instrument.
So as a violinist, your area is really the classical music and folk music, rather than, let's say, the pop music that you hear on TV today. To what extent does folk music, classical music, have a share of the listenership within Norway in general terms? Is it popular, or is it more of a niche interest amongst most people in Norway?
I think for classical music, there is definitely a little bit more of an older audience we're looking at. And I think it comes a little bit part to, there's not, of course, there is music education, but it varies very much whether it's a good education and like something that makes you enthusiastic about music, or whether it's something you have to get through in order to tick it off your schedule. I love classical music so much myself, because I think it's the only art form I know of where you can go from the whole emotional range from A till Z, or O, as we would say in Norway, where you can really have the full whole emotional range, whether you are, in need of just comfort, or just feeling happy, or just want to get just a break from everything, to sit down and just feel calm. It's really such an incredible connection to have with something that doesn't even have words, and I think that's really, really powerful. So I wish more people would discover it and more people would be able to hear it. But Norway definitely has a bit of an older audience, no doubt. I play quite a lot in, I play a lot also in Central Europe and also in Asia, and particularly in Asia, you see there's so many young people coming to the concerts, and it's such a awakening into what classical music can do for you. And I'm really happy to see that. When it comes to folk music, it really has been, it's become more and more popular, I would say, in the maybe last 10 years to play amongst the youth. I have a feeling that the environments and the people you find a bit outside the big cities are definitely gotten bigger. So I think there must be some sort of awakening also what you can do, and particularly when people started to mix folk music with either it was rock or a bit of metallic, those became a very popular mix to do, and it really worked so well. There is something about that really, the extremely pure sound of Hardangerfiddle, for instance, which it's basically a solo instrument. But then you put on rhythms, you put on a whole different groove, and it became something very, very catchy.
That's an interesting point, Eldbjørg, because when I think of violin and Norway, I think of Alexander Rybak and the Eurovision Song Contest in I don't know, was it like 2010, something like that? It was 10, 12 years ago, something like that. And of course, he, at the time, won Eurovision for Norway, playing a violin, but with a pop song, essentially. And I think he had like the highest number of points ever scored in Eurovision history at the time. So
they did.
Am I right in suggesting that might have been a trigger for more people to listen to that kind of music, or is that just one moment in the history of folk music in Norway?
No, I hope so. I hope people get curious about it, because I think particularly for the folk music in Norway, it's such a big identity. It's such a big part of, first of all, who we are, but also where you're from. And it's such a way of expressing yourself. And I really, really hope that it did have such an impact. And I'm really happy that it's possible to show that you can also use music in such a way. It doesn't always have to be either a bit, particularly classical music are often thought of as being a bit stiff and a bit, not so easy to understand what's going on. Sometimes you think you need to know everything in order to listen, but that's really not the case. You can just enjoy, just sit down, enjoy, and just take it in, and hopefully it gives you something. But that's also why it was so good that he used the violin, because it's also showcases that it can be used in so many different ways, and that's one of them.
Yeah. When it comes to other artists, who are some that you want to pick out as being especially relevant these days on the Norwegian folk music scene?
Ooh, there's quite a few, actually. I will actually also pick out one that I was recently interviewing for my own podcast, is Ottar Kosa, who is both an excellent fiddle player, but also a violin maker. And I think just to have someone who knows and understands that craft, I think is incredibly valuable, because it is actually dying out a little bit. There is definitely too many older people who are making instruments that are not along anymore, and it's such an important knowledge to have. So he's doing a really, really important work. And then there's also, I love this group. It's called Valkyrian All-Stars. They are really, really fun. And they also use folk music and Hardangerfjord in particular with a bit kind of tougher expression. It's more like towards rock, but it also showcases how much fun you can have with playing around with expressions. It doesn't have to always be so set.
Excellent. And what was the name of that last band again?
The second one is Valkyrian All-Stars, are they called? Yeah. They're a really fun group. You should check them out.
Yeah. Something I've noticed recently in a lot of folk music I've heard is references to mythology, and especially in the north of Norway, this emergence of Sami influences into pop music. And I'm thinking, let's come back to Eurovision again. There was a couple of years ago, the supergroup whose name escapes me right now used the Sami yoik incorporated into the song, and the theme of the song was the Northern Lights and the sort of mystical nature of them with people over the years. Is this something you see a lot of? You've already talked about the connection with nature, but this is a normal way of that making its way into music?
I think it's quite interesting, actually, because a lot of them, whether you say Sami, or I would maybe feel a bit more safer talking about my own tradition, which is the folk music, but a lot of that tradition is not written down. It's only passed on from generation to generation, just purely by learning. You sit and learn and listen, and then you try to do it yourself, and then slowly you get the full kind of library in your head of tunes to play. And a lot of the tradition is quite conservative, actually. You're not really supposed to change very much. You're supposed to leave it as it is and just preserve it for next generations. But that's also why I think it is really important to put it into different contexts and try to play a little bit around with it, because otherwise, if it becomes too strict and too square, it's also not very approachable. But when it comes to folk music, and particularly the Hardangerfjord, it does have such a distinct role to play, because you also have the tunes where people dance to. So, for instance, in the area where I'm from, there's a lot of gatherings that happens where you can be a newborn and then the oldest might be in their 80s, and they're all in the same gathering and enjoying music, talking, eating something, maybe dancing a bit, listening to the music. And that's also such a connector for society, that you can use folk music in such a way. But I do think it's important to play a bit and not to be too strict sometimes. I think that's important.
You mentioned gatherings there, and something I've seen in Norway is the sheer number of music festivals that take place. And maybe it's more noticeable just because they are condensed into the period of time when the weather is okay to hold an outdoor festival. What are some of the big folk music festivals that people can attend in Norway under a normal year?
There are definitely quite a few. When it comes to one of the bigger ones, you have, for instance, a lot of the world music festivals that are also combining with other genres. You have, for instance, in Førde, there's a really, really great one. And then up in Trondheim region, you have Hilmar Festival. That's also a really great festival, which I've been to many times. And in the area I'm from, there is Jørn Hilme-stevne. And there's actually quite a few all around Norway. And like you pointed out, it's quite surprising how many festivals there are. Even in the region where I'm from, Valdres, I think it's around 6 counties and roughly around 17,000 people. But even for that little amount of people, we have, I think, 15 festivals, which is, I think, quite a big number when you think about how many people are moving around all the time. And then I think the one that's really exciting to attend is the Landskapleiken, which is the annual competition for folk musicians, where you have the 3 different levels you can compete in. It's the A levels, B levels, or C levels. And it's really such a great gathering of the best performers there are. And it's not only for fiddle, it can also be for song and for dance, whether it's solo or together as a duo or even bigger groups. And it's just a celebration, a big celebration of what the folk music environment is. So that one is also really fun to go to.
I should say that when we talk of festivals, we're not talking the scale of a Glastonbury or something like that here. No. Many of these are small, maybe just a few thousand people, very family friendly. In most cases, there's no sort of camping element that people turn up for the day and then they go home in the evening. It's more relaxed pace, shall we say?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's also good, because if you wanted to be in a tent in -20, you would have to be quite brave.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's shift gear and look at pop music for the moment, because most famous Norwegian artists internationally tend to be pop musicians or at least rock and metal, but those sort of genres. Many of them that are famous overseas choose to sing in English, and understandably, folk music tends to be in Norwegian. It's sort of by definition going to be in Norwegian. And I've spoken to a few musicians that I've interviewed over the years that sing in English, and they give me 2 answers as to why. One is obvious, that's commercial success. It's more likely that they're going to sell records in the UK and the US and so on if they sing in English. The other one, and I'd really like to get your opinion on this, is that they think singing in Norwegian sounds ugly, and that they have more ways to express themselves creatively in English, because there's so many words, there's so many ways to construct sentences. You sound surprised, so I'm guessing you're not going to agree with what they say. How do you see the language issue there?
Well, first of all, I should say as a disclaimer, as a violinist, I don't actually have to use my words when I play, so maybe that's the difference already. But I would think, just based off my own experience, because I also have a dialect from Valdres, and I find that when you have a dialect, and this goes for, I think, almost anywhere in Norway, you have so much richness when it comes to language and vocabulary. And when we talk about Norwegian, yes, and you say bokmål, which is one of the standard versions, and all Danish basically. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely not the most richest language. You can use nynorsk, which is a compilation of a lot of the dialects we have in Norway, is much more rich. And then you also have the local and regional flavors, to say, which also adds a very, very different expression. So, for instance, the dialect I speak, there's quite a few words which you don't find in bokmål. A lot of the dialect is also based off German grammar, which is a bit funny. So it's a very big richness in the language if you look for it. So yeah, I mean, I'm maybe a little bit surprised by that argument, but I can, of course, understand I mean, Norway as a country, yes, you can always say you can speak with Danish and Swedish people, but that itself is not that many millions compared to people who would understand English. But having said that, I do think it's something very beautiful when I hear people sing in their native language, because it somehow feels a bit more connected.
Sure. I guess you compose music. Have you ever written lyrics?
No, no, actually not. Yeah, so, I only do the melodic part.
If you were to start a new career or a new spin-off as a songwriter, you would absolutely just choose Norwegian and sing in a local dialect? Is that sort of the path you would go down, you think?
That's kind of what I'm setting myself up to, isn't it?
It sounds like it, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose, actually. I do think it's very important that whatever you choose to do musically, you do hopefully with a very clear sense of why you want to do it. And if I was ever to actually write something, it would be in dialect, because to me, I feel the most close to who I am as a person and how I would express myself. Even for me, writing bokmål, which is what I do most of the time, I cannot even pronounce many of the words properly because I sound so fake. It's not me. And I think also language is so connected to your identity and how certain words mean something particular because they're connected to a memory or to a reference, all those things. So I suppose if I ever were to write something, it would probably be dialect, yes.
Perhaps then the people that are writing in English, they're writing pop songs. There's perhaps less meaning in those. They come from a place, it's more about the rhythm and the melody than the actual content of the lyrics. And so singing in English, it's less of an artistic choice and more of a commercial one in that regard.
Maybe, but on the other hand, there's also, there's so much incredibly beautiful poetry you also find in the English language, and I think there's definitely a style and a way of expressing yourself that is very, I think, understandable to many, and not only because the language is the international, but because it's something like you say something about the rhythm, something about how you do the sentencing. All those things, of course, also make a big difference, I think.
Okay, Eldbjørg, let's hear about your podcast. We mentioned it earlier, the Nordics Unveiled. What is it? And just as importantly, why did you start it?
So the Nordics Unveiled is a journey into the North, trying to explore and find out what is actually typically Nordic. From music to architecture to even design. Art history, just to mention a few things. And of course, I should also really make sure to mention the traditional music, both folk music and also the Sami culture. It's so much to dive into, and it's such an exciting project to take on. For me, this is definitely a Corona project. I would have loved, of course, I assume I would have done this anyways, but now with having a bit more extra time from not traveling, it became the perfect setting to dive into this. And the reason for it is it's been something I've been quite curious about for a long time, particularly when I travel abroad and play abroad. I do quite often get the question of what is Nordic, what's a typical Nordic sound, what do people think of when you say Nordic? And I get everything from people saying, but it's almost in the North Pole, to knowing, not necessarily knowing the difference between Sweden and Norway, which I have to say I would also understand. But it's a lot of curiosity, and particularly from Germany and from China, and also the US, and people who have either ancestors coming from Norway or having a particularly good feeling about Norway. There's a lot of curiosity. And I felt like I couldn't really answer all those questions. So I thought, why not make a podcast and dive a bit into this and try to get some answers.
And we should say, given the conversation we just had, that you are doing the podcast in English, right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
And to exactly the point that you want people to actually understand what you're saying. So that's why.
Excellent. So it's really aimed at an audience outside the Nordic region to learn more about the Nordics.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people have sometimes a bit like the fantasy version of the Nordic, a bit like, from the Frozen movies kind of Nordic feeling. And I I just feel like the Nordic has so much to show and to say, and it's becoming more and more an important area, I think, particularly if you look up to the Arctic and to Svalbard, and both for geopolitical reasons but also for environmental reasons, and to then dive a bit into what the culture also is, has been really eye-opening.
Excellent. Now, Eldbjørg, we spoke a little before we started recording. You mentioned that you've lived in Germany and Austria, I think you said, as well as Norway. And you've only recently moved back to Norway. So given that a large proportion of listeners to this show are interested in life in Norway as a foreigner, have your perceptions on Norway changed now that you've come back after spending years abroad?
Both yes and no. I mean, I spent 7 years in Vienna and around 3 years in Berlin after that. And also in this whole time, I was traveling a lot, which is, of course, is super fun. And I have been exposed to so many cultures and countries that I don't think I would have if I wasn't a violinist. And I think all those things also affect how you see your own country. I love so much being back in Norway. I really missed my country, I have to say, and to an extent that I didn't even think that I would. Everything from just being on the street and you hear Norwegian around you and all the beautiful dialects there is. In Norway, people just want to have a good life. You work, of course, very well and very hard, but you also have such a nice balance in having a good life and being able to achieve what you want to achieve. I also love so much that I'm in Oslo right now, and even in Oslo you have the ocean right there, but you also have mountains around. You can really be close to nature, and that's such an amazing balance to have. Particularly when I travel so much, I'm very happy to come back to Norway, and it's just peaceful. You can really think, you can take it easy, you can really feel well. So there's a big focus on wellness, I would say. At the same time, despite having, I would say, quite a bit of jantelaw, even in this country, there's also a very big optimism, I would say, amongst Norwegian people. In general, people are not afraid to try out new things and to get themselves out there and to be part of the world. And at the same time, you can also always come back and be in the safe nest up north. So that's something I really appreciate even more now than when I left when I was young. And there's definitely something really unique about Scandinavia as a whole, how people treat each other, how you are just everyone that kind of contributes to the same society. The social democratic model is something that I also have come to appreciate very, very much. And there's just it's a big care and understanding I find in society. And I notice very much when I travel abroad, if I've been in Norway a long time, I do notice that a certain Norwegianness creeps up a bit, being you are a bit more careful, a bit more, not maybe as outgoing. But I think that's also a wonderful part of Norwegians, is that it does take sometimes a little bit of time to get to know them. But when you do, they're there forever.
Okay, Eldbjørg, I'm now going to ask you the 3 questions that I ask every guest on the Life in Norway show. These are typically asked to foreigners living here, of course, so it's always nice to hear what a Norwegian will say. You've already given us some answers to this first one, but if you can give us some quick answers, please. What's the best thing about living in Norway?
The best thing for me is the balance between being in a very active, fun city and then having the nature just outside my doorstep.
And the most challenging thing you find about living in Norway?
Well, I freeze most of the time, so I find the cold a bit hard sometimes. But as we say in Norway, there is no such thing as bad weather. It's just bad clothes. So there you go.
And your favourite place in Norway, whether that's a whole town or a special spot somewhere on top of a mountain?
Oh, I have so many places I could say to that question, but I have to be a bit subjective, let's say, and say Jotunheimen. That I think is one of my favorite places. Whether it is to go hiking in the summer and bring a tent and stay out in nature for days, or it's in the wintertime where you can go skiing. It's just such a magical place, and it's so empowering, and you at the same time really puts, at least for me, it really puts everything in balance.
You're not the first person to say Jotunheim to that question, and I imagine a lot of music and creative ideas have been conceived in those mountains as well. Eldbjørg, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people find out more about you, your music, and your podcast?
You can find out more on my website, which is eldbjorghemsing.com, where all the episodes of my podcast is out. Otherwise, I'm of course also on Spotify and Apple and, well, basically all the platforms you can think of.
And I'll include links to Eldbjørg's website and most things we've talked about on the show today, so you can check spellings before you find out more about Norwegian folk music. That will be on the show notes page at lifeinnorway.net/podcast. Eldbjørg, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great pleasure.